It began with a map, not a map found in a dusty archive or a prestigious university library, but a map discovered in the lining of a discarded steamer trunk in a basement that smelled of damp earth and forgotten lives. It was a map of the world as it was understood in the late 18th century, yet it featured a territory that no modern textbook dares to name, a vast, sprawling expanse of Central Asia and North America, labelled with a word that felt like a bruise on the history of the world, Tartaria. I looked at the borders, I looked at the cities, I looked at the topography. Then I looked at my own education. There was a void where this empire should have been. It was not a small omission. It was not a minor clerical error. It was a total systematic erasure. Ask yourself why a landmass larger than Europe, cited by every major cartographer, from Mercator to Ortelius, would simply vanish from the collective consciousness of the West within a single generation. What if the history we are taught is not a record of what happened, but a curated selection of what we are permitted to know? I started digging into the National Gazette. I looked for the exact moment the narrative shifted. I looked for the day the ink changed. I found it in the winter of 1812. Not a revolution of weapons, but a revolution of nomenclature. The National Gazette was more than a newspaper. It was the ledger of reality for the burgeoning American Republic. In its columns, the world was categorized, weighed, and sanctioned. Before 1812, the word Tartary appeared frequently, associated with grand architecture, advanced metallurgy, and a complex network of trade that defied the primitive labels later applied to it. After 1812, the word began to dissolve. It was replaced by wilderness. It was replaced by tribal territories. It was replaced by Charlotte's Islands. This was not a natural evolution of language. It was a deliberate act of institutional gatekeeping. The load distribution of historical truth was being shifted from the shoulders of the inhabitants to the desks of the bureaucrats. I walked through the streets of Philadelphia, looking at the stone foundations of buildings that predated the official records. I saw the patterns. I saw the oversized doorways and the subterranean windows that suggested a city built upon a city, not built by us, not built for us. Something else. The stones don't lie, even when the Gazette does. I began to realize that the Great Fire or the Great Flood narratives used to explain the sudden disappearance of old world structures were too convenient. They were the clean-up crew for a memory hole. If you look closely at the architecture of the mid-19th century, you notice a recurring anomaly. We are told these massive Greco-Roman structures were built by pioneers with horse-drawn carriages and hand tools in a matter of months. Ask yourself if that is physically possible. Look at the precision of the stone cutting. Look at the atmospheric electricity collectors, the spires and domes that were later labelled as mere decoration. These were not the works of a fledgling nation struggling for survival. These were the remnants of an integrated global power grid that had been decapitated. The National Gazette didn't just report the news, it provided the new legends. It told us we built it all from nothing. It told us the ruins we found were actually our own new creations. This is the erasure trope in its most aggressive form. To destroy a people, you do not need to kill them. You only need to kill their grandfathers' stories. I found a specific entry in the Gazette dated November the 14th, where the editor casually mentioned a correction in the geographical understanding of the East. It was the linguistic equivalent of a burial. The pattern is not localized, it is a global resonance. From the star forts of the Netherlands to the identical bastions in the heart of the American Midwest, the geometry is too precise to be accidental. These are not defensive structures built for gunpowder warfare. The angles are wrong. The load distribution is designed for something else entirely. If you map these star forts, you see a network that follows the old ley lines of the Tartarian world. Yet, the Gazette of the early 1800s began to reclassify these sites as frontier outposts or colonial fortifications. They took the legacy of a high-energy civilization and rebranded it as the primitive scrapings of a colonial expansion. Why the deception? Perhaps the answer lies in the technology. What if the Industrial Revolution was actually a recovery period? What if we weren't inventing new machines, but digging up old ones and failing to understand how they truly worked? The somber reality is that we are living in the ruins of a much greater house, pretending we laid the foundation stones ourselves. Consider the silence surrounding the world's fairs. These gargantuan temporary cities were supposedly built in record time, only to be demolished immediately after. Look at the photos of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Look at the White City. We are told it was made of plaster and hemp. Look at the light. Look at the scale. Does it look temporary to you? Or does it look like an ancient capital being looted of its knowledge before being dynamited to hide the evidence? The National Gazette and its peers across the globe celebrated these events as triumphs of modern progress. But what if they were actually the final liquidations of the Tartarian estate? A fire sale of a conquered culture. The public was invited to marvel at the new technology, which was likely just the repurposed scraps of the old world's atmospheric power. Not progress, not innovation, theft. I spent weeks in the archives, tracking the flow of gold and the movement of families who rose to power during this era of erasure. The names are familiar. The institutions are the ones we trust today. They are the gatekeepers of our history, the donors to our museums, the authors of our textbooks. They are the ones who signed the orders to rewrite the National Gazette. I found a letter from a prominent diplomat of the time, hidden in a collection of mundane financial records. It spoke of the necessity of a clean slate and the danger of the old maps. He wasn't talking about borders, he was talking about identity. He was talking about the erasure of a global heritage that didn't fit the narrative of the New World Order. The skepticism of authority is not a choice. It is a requirement for anyone who wants to see the truth behind the curtain of the 19th century. What happened to the people? A population that spanned continents does not simply evaporate. They were reclassified. They were broken into smaller, manageable ethnic groups. They were told they were nomadic. When their cities were built of stone and frequency, they were told they were illiterate. When their libraries were being burned or moved to the Vatican, the Gazette reported on the pacification of these regions with a clinical detachment that masked the scale of the tragedy. It was a cleansing of the spirit. We see the echoes of it in the boarding schools where children were forbidden from speaking their languages. We see it in the renaming of every river and mountain. The map was not just redrawn, the soul of the land was overwritten. Not a mistake, not a coincidence, a strategy. As I sit here, surrounded by photocopies of 200-year-old newsprint and high-resolution scans of forbidden maps, I feel a sense of profound vertigo. The ground beneath our feet is a palimpsest. Every park is a buried city. Every grand old post office is a repurposed temple. The National Gazette was the tool used to flatten the depth of our history into a two-dimensional lie. We are taught that the past was a dark age of mud and toil, leading linearly to our enlightened present, but the evidence suggests a cycle, a peak, a fall, and a forced forgetting. Ask yourself why the elite are so obsessed with the year 1812. Ask yourself why the history of the Tartarian Empire is the only thing that unites the warring academics of the 19th century in a wall of silence. The institutional erasure is almost complete. Most people will look at a map of Grand Tartaria and laugh. They will call it a myth. They will call it a misunderstanding of Latin labels. They have been trained well. They have been fed the Gazette's version of reality for so long that they can no longer recognize the scent of a cover-up. But for those who have eyes to see, the anomalies are everywhere. They are in the iron fences that were once part of a power grid. They are in the red brick ruins found in the middle of the Australian outback. They are in the staccato rhythm of a history that skips a beat whenever the word Tartary is mentioned. It is a somber realization to know that you are a stranger in your own home, walking through rooms you are told don't exist. We are nearing the end of the paper trail, but the investigation is only beginning. The National Gazette was the first layer of the veil. To pierce it, we must look beyond the written word. We must look at the frequency of the architecture. We must look at the load distribution of the lies. What if the day Tartaria was rewritten was not a single day, but a process that is still happening? What if the erasure is ongoing? The philosophical open loop remains. If we don't know where we truly came from, how can we possibly know where we are being led? The ink is still wet on the newest version of the past, not this history, not that history, something else. The archive breathed. It was not the breath of the living, but the stale, recycled air of a tomb where the light of day is a secondary thought. I found myself in the sub-basement of a municipal building in Philadelphia, a structure whose official cornerstone claimed 1872, but whose sub-foundations spoke of an older, more sophisticated masonry. Here, the bound volumes of the National Gazette were not kept for public consumption. They were sequestered. I turned the pages of the 1815 supplements, my fingers tracing the transition from reportage to mythology. The rhetoric had shifted. No longer were the inhabitants of the interior described as sovereign powers or architects of the steppes. They were suddenly remnants. They were the disappearing races. Ask yourself how a civilization capable of diverting the course of the Oxus River and building star-shaped bastions from the Caspian to the Ohio Valley could be reduced to a footnote of nomadic wandering in less than a decade. The institutional erasure was not merely a change in administrative policy. It was a psychological warfare campaign waged through the medium of the daily press. The load distribution of the national identity was being recalibrated to support the weight of a new, artificial origin story. I began to map the fires. Between 1830 and 1890, nearly every major city in the Western world suffered a great fire. New York, Chicago, Boston, London, Moscow, San Francisco. Each event followed a chillingly similar script. A small accident, a lantern, a stove, ignited a conflagration that levelled the old stone and brick cores of the city. Yet, if you look at the daguerreotypes taken in the aftermath, the physics don't align. You see stone melted into slag. You see iron beams twisted like taffy. You see buildings turned to dust, while the wooden telephone poles standing next to them remain unscorched. This was not a chemical fire. This was something else. What if these fires were not tragedies, but urban renewals of a darker sort? What if they were the controlled demolitions of the Tartarian infrastructure that couldn't be easily explained away? The National Gazette heralded the reconstruction as a miracle of modern capitalism, but they never mentioned what was found in the rubble. They never mentioned the tunnels. They never mentioned the mercury vortex turbines found in the basements of the colonial courthouses. The erasure trope requires a vacuum. To fill that vacuum, the gatekeepers invented the concept of the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, creating a linear timeline that conveniently skipped over the global high culture that preceded the current era. I looked at the load distribution of historical importance. Why is so much weight given to the small city-states of Italy, while the vast interconnected empire of Tartary is dismissed as the collection of warring tribes? Consider the architecture of the United States Capitol. We are told it is neoclassical, a tribute to Rome. But what if it isn't a tribute? What if it is a reclamation? Look at the sheer volume of high-quality marble and granite transported across a wilderness that allegedly lacked paved roads. Look at the complexity of the acoustics in the rotunda. This is not the work of a young nation finding its feet. This is the work of an advanced civilization that understood the resonance of stone. The Gazette called it the American spirit, but the stone tells a story of an older, silenced ghost. In the 1820s, the National Gazette began publishing a series of essays on the proper classification of the human family. It was pseudo-academic language at its most lethal. It introduced the idea that certain cultures were inherently prehistorical, regardless of their actual age or achievements. By labelling the Tartarian influence as primitive, the institutional gatekeepers could justify the destruction of their monuments. If a building has no history, it has no rights. I tracked the movement of the Smithsonian Institution during this period. I found records of mound builder artifacts being shipped east by the ton. Skeletons of unusual stature, copper plates with unknown scripts, sophisticated astronomical tools. None of them ever reached the display cases. They vanished into the study collections, euphemism for the memory hole. The Gazette praised the Smithsonian for cleansing the frontier of superstition, but what they were actually doing was sanitizing the evidence of a global predecessor. I travelled to the site of an old star fort in the mid-Atlantic, now repurposed as a municipal park. The walls were 20 feet thick, built with a mathematical precision that would challenge a modern engineer. There were no barracks. There were no magazines for gunpowder. Instead, there were strange copper-lined channels running toward the water. The official plaque, erected in 1924, claimed it was built by the British to defend against the French, but the French never came, and the guns would have been useless at the angles provided by the walls. The structure was not a fort. It was a frequency modulator. It was part of a global system of atmospheric energy harvesting that utilized the ions in the air and the minerals in the earth. The National Gazette didn't just hide the purpose of these sites. They renamed them forts to ensure that any future investigator would look for military history instead of lost physics. Not a defense, not a prison, something else. The skepticism, I feel, is not born of paranoia, but of observation. Rhythmic, staccato sentences of doubt began to fill my journals. The world is too old. The ruins are too advanced. The stories are too simple. I looked at the orphan trains of the late 19th century. Thousands upon thousands of children moved across the country to populate the newly reconstructed cities. Where did they come from? Why were their records so meticulously destroyed? The Gazette spoke of philanthropy, but it felt like a repopulation effort. If you want to start a new world, you need a generation with no memory of the old one. You need a clean slate. You need children who will believe that the grand stone buildings they live in were built by their own tired parents, rather than found in the dust of a conquered empire. The erasure is not just of maps and books, but of the very bloodlines that carried the truth. Consider the tech. In the 1850s, the Gazette featured advertisements for atmospheric regulators and wireless medical devices that seem impossible for the era. Then, suddenly, those technologies disappeared. They were replaced by coal, by steam, by the crude and expensive systems of the monopolists. The load distribution of energy shifted from the free and ubiquitous to the metered and controlled, as the Industrial Revolution was a downgrade. We were forced off the grid of the ancients and onto the wires of the new masters. Anyone who tried to maintain the old ways was labelled a Luddite or a madman. The institutional gatekeepers ensured that the only path forward was the one they owned. The sombre reality is that we are paying for the privilege of using a fraction of the power our ancestors took from the air for free. I found a map from 1806 that showed the Great Tartarian Wall, not in China, but in the American West. I went to the coordinates. I found nothing but a line of scorched earth and a series of natural rock formations that were curiously cubic and stacked in perfect horizontal layers. The erasure was physical. They didn't just burn the books, they ground the stones to dust. The National Gazette of 1844 reported on a volcanic event in the region, but there are no volcanoes there. There are only the scars of a high-energy weapon used to level a city that didn't fit the new map. Ask yourself, what kind of power does it take to turn a metropolis into a wilderness in a single afternoon? What if the Wild West was actually the smouldering West? The investigative essayist must be comfortable with the silence. The gaps in the record are as important as the entries themselves. In the National Gazette's archives, the gaps began to form a pattern. They occurred at the precise moments when the Tartarian narrative was most vulnerable. The 1812 fires in Moscow, the 1848 revolutions in Europe, the 1861 conflict in America. These were not disconnected political events. They were the hard resets of the global system. They were the moments when the old world was finally, violently put to rest. The sombre, intellectually provocative truth is that our history is a patchwork of lies sewn together with the thread of institutional necessity. We are the inheritors of a stolen estate, and the lawyers have spent 2 centuries making sure we never see the original will. As I conclude this segment of the investigation, I am left with a terrifying thought. If they could erase an entire empire, what are they erasing now? The National Gazette has been replaced by the digital feed, the algorithm, and the fact checker. The tools of erasure are more sophisticated, but the goal is the same: to keep us looking at the small, specific anomalies while the global pattern of our enslavement remains invisible. I invite you to look at the spires of your own city. Look at the decorative ironwork. Look at the subterranean windows. Ask yourself what they really are. What if the forbidden knowledge is not hidden in a secret vault, but is hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to remember its true name? Not Tartaria, not the past, something else, something that is still here. The silence in the records is not a void. It is a presence. It is the hum of a machine that has been painted over, but never truly deactivated. I spent the following months tracing the visual evidence of what the National Gazette referred to as the Great Levelling. In the mid-1800s, there was a sudden global obsession with mud. Not just any mud, but a mud flood that supposedly necessitated the raising of street levels in cities as far apart as Seattle and St. Petersburg. We are told by the official historians that this was a matter of sanitation, a Herculean effort to install sewers. Ask yourself if it makes sense to bury the first floors of perfectly functional stone buildings, complete with ornate entryways and finished windows, rather than simply digging a trench in the street. Look at the basement windows of any city built before 1900. They are half submerged in the earth. These were not built as basements, they were ground floors. The institutional gatekeepers want us to believe our ancestors were so incompetent they forgot how to measure the elevation of a plane. What if the mud was not a geological event, but the byproduct of a global catastrophe that the Gazette was tasked with rebranding as urban progress? I began to study the load distribution of the soil itself. In the 1840s, the Gazette ran a series of curious articles about unexplained atmospheric deposits. They described a fine, silty clay that fell from the sky during intense electrical storms. This was the era of the year without a summer, a time of volcanic ash and darkened suns. But the chemical composition of this ash in the archival samples I tracked down was not volcanic. It was processed. It was the pulverized remains of the old world's concrete, glass, and bone. The narrative shifted quickly. By 1850, the Gazette stopped mentioning the skyfalls and began focusing on the miracle of the raised streets. They turned a planetary trauma into a civil engineering triumph, not a disaster, not an apocalypse, something else. The staccato rhythm of the reconstruction hid the trauma of the survivors. If you are born into a world where the streets are already buried, you do not ask what lies beneath the cobblestones. You simply walk. The skepticism of authority led me to the concept of antiquitech. If you look at the old photographs of the 19th century skyline before the great fires did their work, you see a forest of spires. They weren't just for bells. Many of them were topped with intricate metal arrays, globes, and mercury-filled tubes. The National Gazette of 1868 dismissed these as aesthetic flourishes of the Gothic revival. But ask yourself why a practical, profit-driven society would spend millions on non-functional metal ornaments at the highest points of their buildings. What if these were the receivers for a wireless power grid that spanned the globe? What if the Tartarian Empire didn't need coal or oil because they had mastered the extraction of energy from the ionosphere? The institutional erasure of this technology was the greatest heist in human history. They didn't just steal the land, they stole the lightning. They forced us into a scarcity mindset by hiding the fact that energy was once as free as the air we breathe. I found a ledger in the basement of a defunct power company in New York, dated 1882. It contained a list of decommissioned nodes. The locations matched the sites of the old star forts and the destroyed World's Fair pavilions. The notes were written in a pseudo-academic shorthand that spoke of neutralizing the atmospheric potential and installing metered induction. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. The Gazette began a campaign praising the Edison era and the Tesla marvels, but they were careful to frame these men as lone geniuses, inventing the future, rather than scavengers, trying to reverse engineer a shattered past. The load distribution of our modern world is built on the lie that we are the peak of technological evolution. The reality is that we are the scavengers, living in the attic of a palace we no longer understand. Consider the star forts again. If they were truly fortifications, why are so many of them located in depressions surrounded by higher ground? Any military commander would tell you that's a death trap. But if they were earth batteries, massive geometric capacitors designed to store and distribute terrestrial energy, then their location in water-rich basins makes perfect sense. The National Gazette renamed them. The history books repurposed them. The erasure trope works because it provides a reasonable explanation that stops further inquiry. It's a fort, they say, and we stop looking at the copper veins in the masonry. It's a decorative dome, they say, and we stop asking why it's coated in gold leaf and connected to an iron rod that goes deep into the water table. In the 1870s, the National Gazette published a series of maps of the Indian territories in the American West. I noticed a recurring error. Large rectangular areas were marked as uninhabitable salt flats or volcanic barrens. When I overlaid these with older pre-1812 maps, these areas corresponded exactly with the major metropolitan hubs of the Tartarian Federation. They weren't barrens, they were ruins. They had been glassed. The evidence of high-energy warfare is written in the desert sands, which have been fused into trinitite-like glass in areas where no nuclear tests were ever officially conducted. The somber truth is that the Indian wars were not just a conflict with nomadic tribes, they were a mopping up operation against the remaining strongholds of a global superpower. The Gazette called it Manifest Destiny. I call it the liquidation of the evidence. I spoke with a retired cartographer who had spent his career in the deep archives of the Department of the Interior. He spoke in whispers, his voice tense with a fear he couldn't quite name. He told me about the redacted topography project of the 1950s, which sought to remove any remaining anomalous mounds from official geological surveys. He said they weren't mounds, they were buildings. They were so large, so covered in sediment from the mud flood that they looked like hills. But when the highway crews cut through them, they found steel reinforcement and hallways. The Gazette never reported this. The institutional gatekeepers sent in the archaeological teams who immediately declared the sites sacred burial grounds to prevent any further excavation. Not protection, not respect. Something else. The rhythmic, staccato beat of my investigation led me back to the National Gazette's coverage of the 1890 census. It was the first time they declared the frontier closed. It was also the year they began the systematic destruction of the old world records in the name of modernization. They were burning the receipts. If you control the census and you control the history, you can make anyone disappear. You can make an entire empire of millions of people vanish from the books. You can reclassify them as immigrants or refugees from somewhere else. You can take the grand masonry of Tartaria and tell the world it was built by the great pioneers who arrived with nothing but their shirts and a dream. Ask yourself, if your ancestors built the cathedrals of Europe and the capitals of America, why did they live in sod huts and wooden shacks until the cities were miraculously discovered? The erasure is so thorough because it is multi-generational. We are now 5 or 6 generations removed from the day Tartaria was rewritten. The memory has faded from a scream to a whisper and finally to a silence that feels like peace. But it is not peace, it is a lobotomy. We have been stripped of our true heritage and given a plastic substitute. We are told we are the children of progress, but we feel like the children of a funeral. The intellectually provocative reality is that the new world was not new at all, it was just newly conquered, and the National Gazette was the mouthpiece of the victors, ensuring that the losers stayed buried under the mud and the lies. As I prepare to go deeper into the institutional gatekeeping of the 1890s, I find myself looking at the faces in the old photographs. The people look tired. They look out of place. They are dressed in rags, yet they stand in front of marble palaces. They look like squatters. They look like us. The sombre, mysterious truth is that we are all squatters in a civilization we didn't build, using tools we don't understand, reading a history that was written to keep us from ever finding the keys to the front door. Not this story, not that story, something else. The investigation continues, but the load distribution of the truth is becoming too heavy to bear alone. The year 1893 remains a scar on the timeline of human memory. It was the year of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, an event the National Gazette described as the pinnacle of the American century. But when you look at the photographs, you are not looking at a temporary fairground. You are looking at a resurrected city. Huge, white Greco-Roman structures spanning hundreds of acres, built with a sophistication that rivals modern engineering. We are told these were lath and plaster constructions, meant to be burned and bulldozed once the crowds left. Ask yourself, why would an impoverished nation in the midst of an economic depression spend the equivalent of billions of dollars to build a ghost city out of cardboard? What if they didn't build it? What if they simply uncovered it? What if the fair was a massive gaslighting operation designed to explain away the existence of an ancient, high-tech capital that had been reclaimed from the mud? The institutional gatekeepers needed a narrative, and the Gazette provided it. They called it the White City, a symbol of the future, while it was actually a tombstone for the past. The load distribution of this lie is massive. It requires us to believe that thousands of master craftsmen appeared out of nowhere, built a city that surpassed the architecture of Rome in 18 months, and then watched in silence as it was systematically destroyed. The National Gazette reported on the tragic fires that consumed the fairgrounds shortly after the closing ceremonies. These fires were convenient. They were the clean-up crew. They erased the evidence of the internal infrastructure, the copper conduits, the stone foundations, the non-commercial energy systems. If you look at the floor plans that survived, you see a layout that mirrors the star forts. You see a grid designed for the movement of energy, not just people. The staccato rhythm of the demolition teams matched the rhythm of the printing presses. Not a celebration, not an exhibition, something else. I began to investigate the Great Reset of the 1890s. This was the decade when the Gazette and other sanctioned outlets began to aggressively push the narrative of the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans as the sole progenitors of high culture. They took the Tartarian architecture found across the Americas, Russia, and Asia and rebranded it as classical revival. It was a brilliant move of institutional gatekeeping. If you find a massive dome in Ohio, you are told it is a tribute to a dead civilization thousands of miles away, rather than a functional relic of the one that was here 5 minutes ago. The erasure trope relies on distance. By placing the glory of the past in a distant land and a distant time, they make the ruins under our feet invisible. We walk past a stone courthouse with 20-foot pillars, and we think of Caesar, not the people who were cleared from that land in 1812. The skeptical investigator must look at the water. The Tartarian civilization was hydraulic. Every major city was connected by a network of canals that were later filled in or renamed as natural rivers. The National Gazette of 1895 spoke of the reclamation of the swamps, but the maps from 1780 show these were sophisticated transit systems. Why destroy a perfectly functional canal network? Because canals are independent. They allow for the free movement of goods and people outside the controlled rail networks of the monopolists. To centralize power, the gatekeepers had to destroy the decentralized infrastructure of the old world. They filled the canals with the rubble of the demolished cities. They paved over the veins of the empire. They turned a world of flow into a world of barriers. The somber reality is that the 1890s was also the era of the re-education of the historian. I found records of university grants from the newly formed Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations. These grants were not for the discovery of new history, but for the standardization of it. Any professor who mentioned Tartaria, or the anomalies of the American mounds, or the impossibilities of the star forts was stripped of their credentials. The Gazette began to run science columns that ridiculed any mention of atmospheric electricity or pre-colonial masonry. They created the crackpot label. They built a mental fence around the truth. What if the most effective way to hide a secret is to make it socially embarrassing to talk about? Ask yourself why you feel a flicker of shame or doubt when you question the timeline. That is the ghost of the Gazette, still whispering in your ear. I tracked a specific shipment of architectural salvage from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. It didn't go to a landfill. It was sent to a private estate in Virginia, owned by a high-ranking member of the Smithsonian Board. I went there. I found a garden filled with stone pillars that were supposed to be plaster. They were solid granite. They were weathered by centuries of use, not months of affair. The temporary narrative was a cover for a global liquidation. These fairs were the distribution points for the looted wealth of the Tartarian world. The elite took the best pieces for their private collections, and the Gazette told the public that the rest had been burned for safety reasons. The load distribution of the truth was being concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. In the midsection of my research, I stumbled upon the great silence of the North. If Tartaria was a global power, its heart was in the Arctic and Siberia. Yet, the National Gazette of the late 19th century portrayed these areas as frozen, uninhabitable wastes. This contradicts the maps of the 1600s, which show a temperate green north with thriving cities. What happened? A climate shift? A weapon? Or a systematic reclassification? I found a report from an 1898 expedition that mentioned ruined cities of marble emerging from the melting ice. The report was never published in the Gazette. It was seized by the naval authorities. The institutional gatekeepers decided that the North was to be a void. They erased the top of the world to hide the crown of the old empire. The intellectually provocative question is not just if they lied, but how they managed to keep the lie alive for so long. The answer is in the rhythm of the information. The Gazette provided a constant stream of new discoveries, the telephone, the light bulb, the automobile, to keep the public looking forward. If you are always chasing the next miracle, you never look back at the one you lost. They gave us the industrial age as a shiny toy to distract us from the fact that we were living in a de-energized wasteland. Not this future, not that future, something else. A future that was actually a managed decline. As I walked through the ruins of an old textile mill in New England, I saw the same patterns. The brickwork was too perfect. The location, right on the water's edge, was designed for more than just a water wheel. I saw the rusted remains of what looked like a massive tuning fork embedded in the foundation. The Gazette called it pioneer ingenuity. I saw it for what it was. A fragment of a lost frequency-based industry. The somber, mysterious truth is that our ancestors didn't work nearly as hard as we are told. They had a world that worked for them. We are the ones who have been forced into the sweat of our brow by a system that intentionally broke the machines of the past. The 10 parts of this investigation are coming together into a single, terrifying picture. The National Gazette was the primary weapon in a war for the human mind. It was the tool used to rewrite the identity of every person on earth. We are the survivors of a mental apocalypse. We are the descendants of the people who were told to forget, but the stones are still here. The star forts are still here. The mud-flooded windows are still here, and the Gazette's ink, though old and faded, still reveals the lines of the lie, if you know how to read between them. Ask yourself, if the world was once united under a single, advanced and free civilization, what does that say about the borders and the bills we have today? What if the global village is not something we are building, but something we are trying to remember? The turn of the century brought with it a finality that the National Gazette celebrated with an almost desperate fervour. By 1900, the narrative of the frontier was officially closed, replaced by the progressive era. But the investigative eye sees a different rhythm. This was not a period of progress. It was the period of the Great Encasement. I spent months documenting the modernization of our legacy infrastructure. Everywhere I looked, I saw the same pattern. Magnificent pre-existing stone structures being covered in smooth, characterless concrete or hidden behind facades of industrial brick. The Gazette called it beautification and structural reinforcement, but the load distribution suggests a more sinister motive. They were concealing the geometry, the intricate fractal patterns of the old masonry, patent ends that may have served as resonators for atmospheric energy were being systematically muffled. Not an upgrade, not a renovation, something else. A silencing of the architectural voice that once spoke of a higher order. I began to focus on the institutional gatekeeping of the American South. Following the total devastation of the 1860s, the region was a laboratory for historical reconstruction. The Gazette portrayed the reconstruction as a political and social endeavour, but the physical reality involved the erasure of massive stone complexes that the official history claimed were plantations. Ask yourself, why would a farm require a 3-story granite mansion with Greek columns, underground vaulted chambers, and ironwork that resembles a circuit board? What if these weren't farms at all? What if they were nodes in the Tartarian power grid, repurposed by a slave-owning elite and then destroyed by the Union to ensure the new monopoly on energy could never be challenged? The somber staccato reality is that the Civil War was a war of liquidation. It was the violent dismantling of the southern nodes of the old world. The skepticism of authority led me to the strange case of the orphanages that proliferated in the Gazette's advertisements between 1905 and 1915. Thousands of children were being processed through these institutions and sent to work in the new factories or to homestead in the West. But where did they come from? The Gazette spoke of immigrant overflow, yet the arrival records at Ellis Island don't account for the sheer volume of parentless children. What if these children were the survivors of the final cleansing of the Tartarian heartlands? If you take a child, strip them of their name, and tell them they are an orphan of a primitive people, you have successfully severed the last thread of the old world. The erasure trope is most effective when it is applied to the living. We are a nation of amnesiacs, raised in the nurseries of our conquerors. I found a technical manual from 1912 buried in the back of a library in Richmond that described the phasing out of non-standard illumination. It was a handbook for city engineers. It gave instructions on how to remove the luminous globes from the tops of streetlights and replace them with the new flickering incandescent bulbs of the electric monopolies. The manual warned that the old globes were dangerous and subject to erratic discharge. Ask yourself, what kind of light bulb works without wires and produces an erratic discharge? It wasn't a bulb, it was a cold plasma receiver. The National Gazette never mentioned the transition. They simply began praising the brightness of the new electric age, ignoring the fact that the cities had been glowing for decades using free wireless energy. The load distribution of the truth was being buried under the weight of a monthly utility bill. Consider the great museums founded during this era. The Gazette heralded them as the repositories of human knowledge. I see them as the evidence lockers of a global crime scene. I visited the storage vaults of a major museum in the Midwest, posing as a researcher for an investigative essay on early industrial metallurgy. What I saw was not industrial. I found massive gold-plated rotors, crystalline lenses the size of carriage wheels, and maps etched onto thin sheets of a metal that felt neither like steel nor copper. They were labelled decorative art or cult objects. The institutional gatekeepers have a word for everything they cannot explain: ceremonial. If a tool is too advanced for the official timeline, it becomes a ritual item. If a building is too large, it becomes a temple. This is the language of the lie. The rhythm of my investigation accelerated as I moved towards the 1920s. This was the decade of the great standardizing. This was when the Gazette and its corporate sponsors began to consolidate all independent newspapers. The narrative became a monolith. The history of Tartary was no longer even being debated or erased. It was simply gone. It had been successfully moved into the realm of fringe and myth. The staccato beat of the new jazz age drowned out the somber echoes of the past. People were told to dance, to consume, and to forget. Not a decade of joy. Not a decade of freedom. Something else. A decade of distraction. I started to map the national parks. Why were these specific areas of the American West cordoned off and protected by federal law? The Gazette said it was to preserve natural beauty. But when you look at the topographical anomalies within these parks, the buttes that look like the stumps of gargantuan ancient trees, the canyons that look like open pit mines, and the rock formations that have the distinct right angles of melted masonry, the truth becomes clear. The national parks are not wilderness areas. They are ruins so vast and so undeniable that the only way to hide them was to call them nature. They are the forbidden zones of the Tartarian Empire. The institutional gatekeepers didn't want us to see the scale of the destruction, so they told us it was a God-given landscape. The intellectually provocative question remains: what happened in the National Gazette on that specific day in 1812? I returned to the microfiche, zooming in on the margins. I found it. A small 3-line retraction in the back of the December issue. It stated that all previous references to the emperors of the East and the great civilized territories of the interior were to be considered poetic license and geographical speculation. It was a total legalistic disavowal of everything they had printed for 20 years. It was the rewrite. From that day forward, the world was a different place. The load distribution of reality had shifted. The empire was dead. Long live the wilderness The sombre, mysterious reality is that the rewrite never stopped. We are still living in the shadow of that 1812 retraction. Every time we look at a star fort and see a military outpost, every time we look at a mud-flooded window and see a basement, every time we look at a cathedral and see a place of worship instead of a power plant, we are validating the lie of the Gazette. We are participating in our own erasure. The investigation is no longer just about maps. It is about the frequency of our own consciousness. Are we tuned to the channel of the gatekeepers, or can we still hear the hum of the old world beneath the concrete? As I close this 10th part of the script, I am left with a terrifying sense of responsibility. I have invited you to investigate alongside me, to ask the what ifs and the why nots. But the truth is a heavy burden. To know that history is a fiction is to realise that the future is an open, unwritten loop. The Gazette tried to close that loop to pin us to a timeline of scarcity and struggle, but the stones are calling. The light is still in the air. Not this end. Not that end. Something else. The investigation is far from over, but the first layer of the veil has been torn. The 1920s were not just a roar of engines and jazz. They were the final application of the sealant. I stood in the shadow of the great bridges of New York, structures that the National Gazette claimed were the triumphs of the new metallurgy. But look at the load distribution. Look at the granite piers that descend deep into the silt, far beyond the reach of the caissons available at the time. Ask yourself why the architects of these bridges often suffered from mysterious illnesses or disappeared from the public record entirely. What if they weren't building? What if they were merely unveiling and securing the submerged transit lines of a world that came before? The Gazette portrayed the construction as a linear struggle against nature, but the rhythm of the work was too fast. It was the rhythm of a scavenger reclaiming a carcass, not a creator birthing a new form. Not an invention, not a feat. Something else. I began to investigate the great drought narratives that the Gazette pushed in the early 1930s. This was the era of the Dust Bowl. We are told it was a combination of poor farming techniques and weather cycles. But when you look at the infrared scans of the American heartland today, you see the outlines of buried irrigation systems that span entire states, systems that are not documented in any pioneer journal. The Gazette spoke of nature's wrath, but what if it was a final atmospheric purge of the remaining Tartarian agricultural nodes? By drying out the land, the institutional gatekeepers forced the remaining independent populations into the cities, where they could be more easily monitored and re-educated. The load distribution of the population was being centralised. The New Deal was the final contract of our surrender. The scepticism I feel toward the mid-century scientific revolution is profound. In the 1940s, the Gazette and its successors began to promote the concept of the atom. They took the ancient science of etheric resonance and fragmented it into a narrative of explosion and destruction. They turned the free energy of the atmosphere into a weapon of terror. I found a collection of suppressed patents from 1947, filed by independent researchers who claimed to have found the hidden frequency of the old stone. They weren't talking about physics, they were talking about architecture. They had discovered that the domes of our state capitals were still vibrating, still trying to pull energy from the air. The Gazette didn't report on their work, they reported on their insanity. The institutional gatekeepers ensured that the only way to the stars was through the expensive combustion-based rockets of the military-industrial complex. Not a leap. Not a boundary. Something else. Consider the post-war boom. This was the era of the suburban sprawl. the levelling of the old city centres, and the birth of the interstate highway system. The Gazette heralded this as the peak of American freedom. But look at the maps. The highways didn't just connect cities, they paved over the ley lines. They destroyed the mounds. They created a physical barrier between the people and the land's original geometry. This was the erasure trope in its ultimate concrete form. If you cannot see the ruins, you cannot ask the questions. I found a memo from a 1954 planning committee that explicitly mentioned the removal of anomalous topographical features to ensure a clean visual field for the modern traveller. They weren't just building roads, they were finishing the job that the 1812 rewrite started. The sombre, mysterious reality is that the space race was the ultimate distraction. While we were looking at the moon, the last remnants of the Tartarian world were being quietly liquidated on Earth. The National Gazette of the 1960s was a masterpiece of propaganda, blending progress with fear to keep the public in a state of perpetual agitation. They gave us the Cold War to explain away the massive military presence in the Arctic and Siberia, the very places where the old empire's ruins were most visible. Ask yourself, why were both superpowers so obsessed with the uninhabitable frozen wastes? What if they weren't watching each other? What if they were both watching the ice melt to see what was coming out of it? The load distribution of the global military was focused on the perimeter of the lie. I travelled to a remote site in the Pacific Northwest where a series of natural basalt columns formed a perfect five-pointed star. The Gazette called it a geological wonder. I saw the tool marks. I saw the way the stone had been vitrified, as if by a heat that shouldn't have existed 10,000 years ago. I realised that the geological timeline itself is an instrument of institutional gatekeeping. By pushing the wonders back millions of years, they make it impossible for us to realise that they are actually the ruins of our own grandfather's world. The staccato rhythm of the deep time narrative is designed to make the human experience feel small and irrelevant. Not a wonder, not a mystery, something else, a monument. In the 1970s, the National Gazette's successors began the digital revolution. This was the final layer of the veil. By moving our history, our maps, and our memories into the digital realm, they made the truth infinitely editable. The rewrite is no longer a day in 1812. It is a continuous real-time process. If a photo of a Tartarian star fort goes viral, it is labelled as AI generated or misidentified. The institutional gatekeepers no longer need to burn books. They only need to change the metadata. The load distribution of truth has been moved from the physical world to the flickering screen. The sombre reality is that we are losing the ability to trust our own eyes. I found an old man in a small town in the Ural Mountains who claimed his grandmother remembered the sky before it was blue. He said the atmosphere used to be different, more conductive, more golden. He said the Great Reset changed the very air we breathe. The Gazette of his youth called people like him fools, but his eyes were clear. He spoke of the day the National Gazette lied as a family legend. He said the rewrite was not about maps, but about the frequency of the heart. If you can make a person believe they are a primitive animal, they will never try to fly. The intellectually provocative truth is that our limitations are a social construct enforced by a history that was written to keep us grounded. The rhythmic staccato beat of my investigation has led me to a final, unresolved philosophical open loop. If Tartaria was a global, advanced, and free civilization, why did it fall? Was it an external enemy, a natural catastrophe, or was it an internal rot, a slow institutional erasure that began from within? The Gazette doesn't give us the answer. It only gives us the silence. We are the inheritors of that silence. We are the investigators of a crime that has no official record. The low distribution of our destiny depends on our ability to look at the ruins and see not a tribute to the past, but a blueprint for the future. Not this end, not that end, something else. As I prepare to deliver the final part of this script, I am struck by the weight of the direct address. Ask yourself, what if? These are not just rhetorical devices. They are the keys to the prison. The National Gazette wanted us to be passive consumers of a sanctioned reality, but the very act of questioning breaks the seal. The sombre, mysterious and unsettling truth is that Tartaria never truly left. It is in the stones, it is in the water, it is in the very geometry of your own soul. The investigation is ending, but the awakening is just beginning. The ink of 1812 is finally drying, and beneath it, the original map is starting to glow.